May 18, 1936. Luna, Germany. The thermometer beside Dr. Friedrich Bergius's industrial reactor reads 427 degrees Celsius. Inside pressure vessels the size of locomotives, brown coal and hydrogen are transforming into something the British Admiralty said was chemically impossible: high-octane aviation fuel. The pressure gauge shows 300 atmospheres, 4,410 pounds per square inch, enough to crush steel if the vessel walls weren't 3 inches thick. Workers in heat-resistant suits monitor the flow rate. Every 6 hours, another ton of lignite, cheap brown coal excavated from mines 50 kilometers away, enters the reactor mixed with recycled heavy oil. Inside, molecular chains are shattering. Carbon atoms are rearranging. Hydrogen atoms are forcing themselves into impossible positions. Chemistry that nature takes millions of years to accomplish underground is happening in hours inside these steel reactors. At the output end, clear liquid flows into collection tanks. Not petroleum, not oil drilled from underground wells. Synthetic fuel, created entirely from coal, water, and electricity. The Nazi regime calls it Ersatzfuel, substitute fuel, but there's nothing substitute about it. This liquid will power Luftwaffe fighters to 400 miles per hour. It will drive panzer divisions across Europe. It will keep U-boats submerged for weeks at a time. Germany has almost no oil wells. The country produces barely 50,000 barrels of crude oil per year, enough to run the nation for about 3 days. But by 1944, Germany would be producing 124,000 barrels of synthetic fuel per day from 25 massive plants like Luna. 124,000 barrels per day from coal, without a single oil well of strategic significance. The technology had been invented 23 years earlier, in 1913, by a German chemist named Friedrich Bergius. And for 6 years of total war, from 1939 to 1945, this technology would keep Germany fighting long after every strategic calculation said its economy should have collapsed from fuel starvation.
Friedrich Karl Rudolf Bergius was born October 11, 1884, near Breslau, in what was then the German Empire. Before studying chemistry, Bergius was sent to work for 6 months at the Friedrich Wilhelm Steel Works in Milheim. His father's way of ensuring the young man understood industrial reality before diving into academic theory. Bergius studied at the University of Breslau starting in 1903, finishing with a PhD in chemistry from the University of Leipzig in 1907, after only 4 years. His dissertation focused on sulfuric acid as a solvent. It was competent work, but unremarkable. What came next would win him a Nobel Prize. During his habilitation at the Technical University of Hanover between 1909 and 1913, Bergius became obsessed with a question that seemed to have an obvious answer. Could solid coal be converted directly into liquid fuel? The obvious answer was no. Coal is a complex organic solid containing large aromatic molecules locked in rigid crystal structures. Petroleum is a liquid containing smaller hydrocarbon chains. The two are chemically related, both are fossilized organic matter, but the molecular structures are fundamentally different. Converting coal to liquid fuel would require breaking massive molecules into smaller ones, pyrolysis. It would require adding hydrogen atoms to the broken molecules, hydrogenation, and it would require doing both simultaneously under conditions extreme enough to overcome molecular bonds, but controlled enough to produce useful fuel, rather than just tar and sludge. The chemistry was theoretically possible, but the engineering was considered impossible. The temperatures required, 400 degrees Celsius to 500 degrees Celsius, were achievable. The pressures required, 200 to 700 atmospheres, were not. No industrial equipment in 1913 could maintain such pressures at such temperatures continuously without catastrophic failure. Bergius built equipment that could. During his habilitation, techniques for the high-pressure and high-temperature chemistry of carbon-containing substrates were developed, yielding a patent on the Bergius process in 1913. German patent 301231, filed August 9, 1913, described a process where dry coal was mixed with heavy oil recycled from the process itself. A catalyst, initially just the iron sulfide naturally present in coal, was mixed into the slurry. The mixture was pumped into a reactor and heated to between 400 degrees Celsius and 500 degrees Celsius under 20 to 70 megapascals of hydrogen pressure. The result was liquid hydrocarbons, synthetic petroleum produced directly from lignite, brown coal. The reaction can be summarized chemically, though Bergius himself took years to fully understand what was happening at the molecular level. Coal, large aromatic hydrocarbons, plus hydrogen equals smaller hydrocarbon chains plus byproducts. The reaction worked, reproducibly, reliably. Bergius filed patents in Germany, Britain, and France. The scientific community was impressed. Industrial companies were skeptical. Because, in 1913, petroleum was cheap and plentiful. The Texas oil boom had just begun. Persian oil fields were coming online. Russian fields in Baku were expanding. Why invest millions developing an expensive, complex process to synthesize oil from coal when natural petroleum cost a fraction of the price? The answer would come 6 years later, when World War I ended and the Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of most foreign oil access.
Carl Goldschmidt, owner of T.H. Goldschmidt AG, later part of Evonik Industries, invited Bergius to build an industrial plant at his factory in 1914, just as World War I began. Production was planned to start immediately. It didn't. World War I consumed Germany's industrial capacity. Steel went to armaments, engineers were conscripted, capital disappeared. The Bergius plant sat partially completed through 4 years of war. Production began only in 1919, after World War I ended, when the need for fuel was already declining. Post-war Germany faced catastrophic economic collapse. The Treaty of Versailles demanded massive reparations. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Industrial capacity was limited by occupation and war damage, and critically, the harsh terms of capitulation limited Germany's ability to purchase oil abroad. Petroleum imports became strategic liabilities. Foreign exchange was scarce. Oil-producing nations could cut supplies to pressure German compliance with treaty terms. The Weimar Republic government recognized the vulnerability and began financing research to maximize the abundant reserves of soft brown coal, lignite, hard brown coal, anthracite, non-cooking coal, and mainly bituminous coal. Germany had centuries' worth of coal. It had almost no oil. Converting coal to liquid fuel wasn't economically competitive with imported petroleum, but it offered energy independence, a strategic necessity for a nation that had just lost a world war partly due to Allied naval blockades starving the economy of resources. Between 1919 and 1925, Bergius struggled to make his process commercially viable. The technical problems were immense. Inflation destroyed capital, and Franz Josef Emil Fischer, another prominent German chemist, criticized Bergius's process publicly, claiming his own alternative method, what would become the Fischer-Tropsch process, was superior. By 1925, Bergius was nearly bankrupt. He sold his patent to BASF,
where Karl Bosch, who had won the 1918 Nobel Prize for the Haber-Bosch ammonia synthesis process, recognized the value of Bergius's work. BASF had the capital, engineering expertise, and industrial infrastructure to develop the process at scale. The Lena plant for the commercial hydrogenation of lignite started production on April 1, 1927. It was the first commercial-scale synthetic fuel plant in history, and it would become the centerpiece of Nazi Germany's fuel production during World War II.
On October 18, 1936, Adolf Hitler announced the four-year plan, appointing Hermann Göring to oversee a massive expansion of German industry to prepare for war. The plan had explicit goals: make Germany self-sufficient in critical resources, particularly rubber and petroleum, within 4 years. Coal liquefaction was an important part of Adolf Hitler's four-year plan of 1936 and became an integral part of German industry during World War II. The economic logic was brutal. Germany consumed approximately 85,000 barrels of petroleum per day. Domestic production was negligible, less than 1,000 barrels per day. The rest came from imports, primarily Romania, but also from American, Russian, and Middle Eastern sources paid for with scarce foreign currency. If war came, and Hitler was planning for war, those imports would be cut off immediately. Germany would have, at best, 6 months of strategic petroleum reserves. After that, the economy would collapse. Mechanized warfare requires fuel. Tanks, aircraft, ships, trucks, motorcycles, all useless without gasoline, diesel, and lubricating oil. The four-year plan allocated enormous resources to expand synthetic fuel production. By 1939, 7 hydrogenation plants were constructed and were producing synthetic petrol. By 1944, 12 hydrogenation plants using the Bergius process and 9 Fischer-Tropsch plants were operating. Production capacity grew exponentially. 1927, single Leuna plant producing small quantities. 1936, multiple plants producing 50,000 barrels per day. 1939, 7 plants producing approximately 72,000 barrels per day. 1943, 20 plants producing 115,000 barrels per day. 1944, 25 plants producing 124,000 barrels per day. By early 1944, German synthetic fuel production had reached more than 124,000 barrels per day from 25 plants, including 10 in the Ruhr area. 124,000 barrels per day. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to a medium-sized oil field, produced entirely from coal using chemistry invented 30 years earlier. Nearly one-third of the Bergius production came from plants in Politz, Polish is police, and Leuna, with one-third more in 5 other plants. The Leuna plant alone employed 35,000 workers, including 10,000 prisoners and forced laborers. The facility covered 3 square miles, or 7.8 square kilometers of land, with 250 buildings. It was the single largest synthetic fuel plant in the world. And by 1944, it was also one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in Europe.
The Bergius process sounds simple. Heat coal with hydrogen under pressure. The reality was extraordinarily complex. Step 1. Coal preparation. Coal was finely ground into powder and dried in a stream of hot gas. The particle size had to be precise. Too large, and the chemical reactions wouldn't proceed efficiently. Too small, and the powder would clog pumps and reactors. Step 2. Mixing. Dry coal powder was mixed with heavy oil recycled from the process. The ratio was critical. Too much coal and the mixture became too viscous to pump, too little and production efficiency suffered. A catalyst was added to the mixture. Early plants used the iron sulfide naturally present in coal. Later plants added tungsten or molybdenum disulfide to improve efficiency. Step 3. pressurization. The coal oil catalyst slurry was pumped into high-pressure vessels. This required specialized pumps capable of moving viscous sludge against pressures exceeding 200 atmospheres. The pumps were massive, steam-driven, and required constant maintenance. Step 4. Hydrogenation. Inside the reactor, the mixture was heated to 400 to 500 degrees Celsius under 200 to 700 atmospheres of hydrogen pressure. At these conditions, the large aromatic molecules in coal began breaking apart, pyrolysis. Simultaneously, hydrogen atoms forced their way into the broken molecular structures, hydrogenation. The reactions were exothermic. They released heat, so careful temperature control was essential to prevent thermal runaway that could destroy the reactor. Step 5. Separation. The reactor output was a complex mixture: gasoline-range hydrocarbons, diesel-range hydrocarbons, heavy oils, unreacted coal residue, and various byproducts. This mixture flowed into separation towers, where different fractions were separated by boiling point. Step 6. Refining. The separated fractions underwent additional refining to remove sulfur, nitrogen, and other impurities. Some fractions were sent to additional hydrogenation reactors for further processing. Heavy oils were recycled back to Step 2 to be mixed with fresh coal. Step 7. Hydrogen production. The entire process consumed enormous quantities of hydrogen. Initially, hydrogen came from steam reforming of coal-derived gases. Later, dedicated hydrogen plants were built using coal gasification. A typical hydrogen demand was approximately 80 kilograms of hydrogen per ton of dry, ash-free coal. The efficiency was poor by modern standards. It took approximately 4 to 5 tons of coal to produce 1 ton of fuel. The energy contained in 4 to 5 tons of coal is significantly greater than the energy in 1 ton of fuel. Most of that energy difference was lost as waste heat or consumed running the plant itself. But from Germany's strategic perspective, efficiency didn't matter. Coal was domestically available in vast quantities. Petroleum was not. A 4-to-1 coal-to-fuel ratio was acceptable if the alternative was no fuel at all. While Bergius developed direct coal liquefaction, Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Coal Research developed an alternative approach: indirect liquefaction through gasification and synthesis. The Fischer-Tropsch process, patented in 1925, took a fundamentally different approach. Step 1. Coal gasification. Coal was reacted with steam and oxygen, or air, at 900 to 1,000 degrees Celsius to produce synthesis gas, a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. Coal plus H2O plus O2 became CO plus H2 plus byproducts. Step 2. Gas cleanup. The synthesis gas was cleaned to remove sulfur, tar, and particulates. Ratios of CO to H2 were adjusted. Step 3. Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. The cleaned synthesis gas flowed through reactors containing iron, cobalt, or nickel catalysts at 150 to 300 degrees Celsius and 20 atmospheres pressure. The CO and H2 reacted to form long-chain hydrocarbons. NCO plus 2NH2 became CH2(N) plus NH2O. The product was primarily diesel and kerosene, perfect for aircraft and submarines. This process was far more efficient and economical than Bergius's, but it did not flourish initially because the world still ran on gasoline. By 1944, Germany operated 9 Fischer-Tropsch plants, producing high-quality diesel and aviation fuel. The process complemented Bergius plants. Together, they provided Germany with complete fuel independence.
On December 10, 1931, Friedrich Bergius received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, sharing the award with Karl Bosch. The citation read, "For their contributions to the invention and development of chemical high-pressure methods." The Nobel Committee recognized that Bergius and Bosch had fundamentally expanded the boundaries of industrial chemistry. High-pressure, high-temperature processes had been considered too dangerous and expensive for commercial use. Bergius proved they could be controlled and scaled to industrial production. By 1931, the Luna plant was producing commercially viable synthetic fuel. Other plants were under construction. The technology worked. It was expensive. Synthetic fuel cost 3 to 4 times more than imported petroleum, but it worked. The Nazi regime would spend the next decade expanding that capacity to levels Bergius himself never imagined possible.
Germany's synthetic fuel program presented a strategic paradox that would define the entire war. On one hand, synthetic fuel gave Germany genuine strategic independence. By 1943, nearly 50% of Germany's fuel came from synthetic production. By 1945, that figure exceeded 75%. Without synthetic fuel, Germany's military would have collapsed in 1940. The Blitzkrieg campaigns that conquered France relied on Romanian oil imports and carefully husbanded reserves. Continuing operations after 1941 required synthetic fuel. On the other hand, synthetic fuel plants were extraordinarily vulnerable. They were massive, easily identifiable from aerial reconnaissance, and required continuous operation to be economically viable. Shutting down and restarting a Bergius plant took weeks. Battle damage could idle plants for months. The Luna Works was one of the largest synthetic oil plants and second most extensive chemical operation in Nazi Germany. The plant employed 35,000 workers, and it was defended by 62,550 military personnel, more defenders than workers. The 14th Flak Division, responsible for protecting Luna, had 28,000 troops, 18,000 RAD personnel, 6,000 male and 3,050 female auxiliaries, 900 Hungarian and Italian volunteers, 3,600 Russian Hiwis, and 3,000 others, thus making up a total of 62,550 persons. Think about that ratio. 62,550 defenders for 35,000 workers. Nearly 2 soldiers for every worker. That's how critical Luna was to German war production. And despite those defenses, Allied bombing devastated it. On May 12, 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched its first major raid against German synthetic fuel plants as part of the oil campaign. The target list included Lona, Pullitz, Zeitz, Lützgendorf, Bohlen, and other major facilities. The operation was part of a broader strategic bombing campaign targeting Germany's petroleum infrastructure. Allied planners had concluded that destroying synthetic fuel production was more effective than trying to destroy individual military units. Cut Germany's fuel supply, and tanks, aircraft, and trucks would become immobile regardless of how many were produced. The raid on Luna involved 195 B-17 Flying Fortresses escorted by P-51 Mustangs. The bombers dropped 1,361 tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs. Flak was so intense that we had no idea how close our bombs came to the target. Smoke from anti-aircraft fire, German smoke pots, and exploding oil tanks turned daylight into twilight. On clear days, only 29% of the bombs aimed at Luna landed inside the plant gates. On radar raids, the number dropped to 5.1%. But even 29% accuracy was enough. Critical distillation towers were destroyed. Hydrogen plants were damaged.
Production dropped from 120,000 barrels per month to 20,000. German work crews labored around the clock to repair damage. Production gradually recovered, only to be hit again. Between May 12, 1944 and April 5, 1945, Allied forces conducted 22 separate raids on Luna, 20 U.S. 8th Air Force raids, 2 RAF raids, and a total of 6,552 bomber sorties. Total bombs dropped were 18,328 tons. The bombing of Luna cost the 8th Air Force 1,280 airmen. In 3 separate attacks by the 8th, 119 planes were lost, and not one bomb fell on the Luna works. The casualty figures are staggering. During the first raid, 126 Luna workers were killed, but the Germans massively increased defenses. Only 175 additional workers were killed in 21 subsequent raids, an extraordinarily low casualty rate given the tonnage of bombs dropped. The 8th Air Force also dropped 12,953 tons of explosives on nearby Merseburg, home to another major synthetic fuel plant. The campaign worked. By September 1944, German synthetic fuel production had collapsed to 20% of peak capacity. By December 1944, production was negligible. Tanks sat immobile, waiting for fuel. Luftwaffe pilots received minimal flight training because aviation fuel was reserved for combat operations. U-boats remained in port because there was no diesel for patrols. Germany's war machine was starving for fuel, and the synthetic fuel plants that had sustained it for 4 years were burning.
The expansion of synthetic fuel production required enormous labor. By 1944, Germany's synthetic fuel industry employed approximately 350,000 workers. Nearly 100,000 were forced or enslaved laborers, concentration camp inmates, prisoners of war, and civilians from occupied territories. At Luena, 10,000 of the 35,000 workers were prisoners or forced laborers. They worked 12-hour shifts in conditions that killed thousands. Chemical exposure, industrial accidents, malnutrition, and deliberate brutality created mortality rates exceeding 15% annually in some facilities. The moral calculus was explicit. Fuel production mattered more than human life. Camp inmates who could no longer work were returned to concentration camps for extermination. They were replaced by new prisoners. The system was designed around disposable labor. This wasn't unique to synthetic fuel plants. Nazi Germany's entire war economy relied on forced labor. But the scale and conditions in synthetic fuel production were particularly horrific because the plants operated continuously. There were no seasonal breaks, no production slowdowns, no rest periods. Coal had to be processed continuously, or the reactors would cool and take weeks to restart. The workers who built Germany's fuel independence paid with their lives, thousands of them. And when Allied bombs destroyed the plants in 1944-45, many prisoners died in the explosions or were executed by guards to prevent them from being liberated.
Germany's synthetic fuel program was simultaneously a technical triumph and strategic failure. Technical triumph. By 1944, 25 plants produced 124,000 barrels per day. Nearly 75% of Germany's fuel was synthetic by war's end. The technology worked reliably for years, despite Allied bombing. Quality was high. Synthetic fuel met or exceeded natural petroleum standards. The program demonstrated that large-scale coal-to-liquids conversion was technically feasible. Strategic failure. Synthetic fuel was 3 to 4 times more expensive than imported petroleum. Plants were vulnerable to strategic bombing. Production never met demand. Germany was fuel-starved throughout the war. Resources invested in synthetic fuel might have been more effective elsewhere. Romania's Ploiesti oil fields produced 100,000 barrels per day of natural crude, roughly equal to all German synthetic production. But Germany lost access to Ploiesti in August 1944. The strategic miscalculation was assuming that domestic fuel production, no matter how expensive or vulnerable, was preferable to dependence on imports. In peacetime, that logic fails. Synthetic fuel can't compete economically with natural petroleum. In wartime, that logic also fails because synthetic fuel plants are prime strategic targets. Germany would have been better served investing in securing natural petroleum sources. The failure to capture Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus was far more damaging than any disruption to synthetic fuel production. Romanian oil production was far more valuable than an equivalent investment in synthetic plants. But the synthetic fuel program did accomplish one critical objective. It delayed Germany's inevitable fuel crisis by 3 to 4 years. Without synthetic fuel, Germany couldn't have sustained operations past 1942. With synthetic fuel, Germany fought until May 1945. That's 3 additional years of war, 3 years of death and destruction, enabled largely by chemistry invented in 1913.
After World War II, Allied forces seized German synthetic fuel plants and technical documentation. The United States, Britain, France, Japan, and South Africa all studied the technology intensively. The United States Bureau of Mines had experimented with coal liquefaction using the Bergius process through a small-scale test unit built in 1937. After the war, captured German technology massively accelerated American research. One plant using the Bergius process was built in Louisiana, Missouri, beginning operation about 1946. The plant produced gasoline in commercial quantities by 1948 at prices slightly higher than petroleum-based gasoline, but of higher quality. But cheap Middle Eastern oil made synthetic fuel economically unviable. The Louisiana plant closed in the 1950s. American synthetic fuel research continued at low levels until the 1970s oil crisis revived interest briefly. South Africa had no known domestic oil reserves and faced international sanctions during apartheid. The government established Sasol, South African Synthetic Oil Limited, to produce fuel from coal using Fischer-Tropsch technology. Sasol plants operated continuously from 1955 onward, producing the majority of South Africa's liquid fuels during the sanctions era. Today, Sasol remains one of the world's largest producers of synthetic fuel. The technology is mature, proven, and economically viable when petroleum prices rise above approximately $60 to $80 per barrel. China has invested heavily in coal-to-liquids technology in recent years, constructing multiple plants using variants of Bergius and Fischer-Tropsch processes. China has massive coal reserves and concerns about petroleum import dependency, exactly the same strategic calculation Germany made in the 1930s. The chemistry Friedrich Bergius invented in 1913 remains relevant more than a century later.
Germany's synthetic fuel program demonstrated several enduring lessons. 1. Chemistry can replace geology at a price. Liquid fuels don't require oil wells. They require carbon, hydrogen, energy, and engineering. Germany proved that nations without petroleum resources can still produce fuel domestically if they're willing to pay the economic and environmental costs. 2. Strategic independence has limits. Domestic production eliminates import dependency, but creates new vulnerabilities. Synthetic fuel plants are larger, more complex, and more vulnerable than oil wells. Strategic bombing can destroy them. Germany gained independence from petroleum imports, but became dependent on facilities that could be destroyed from the air. 3. Economic efficiency matters even in war. Germany invested enormous resources in synthetic fuel, resources that might have been more effective elsewhere. Every ton of steel used to build synthetic fuel plants was steel not available for tanks or ships. Every engineer designing reactors wasn't designing weapons. The opportunity cost was enormous. 4. Technology cannot overcome strategic stupidity. Synthetic fuel gave Germany 3 extra years of warfighting capacity. Those were 3 years Germany used to commit genocide, destroy cities, and fight wars it couldn't win. The technology extended Germany's ability to inflict suffering but couldn't change the war's outcome. Superior technology in service of strategic madness is worse than no technology at all. 5. Environmental costs are externalized in wartime. Coal-to-liquids conversion is energy-intensive and carbon-intensive. For every ton of synthetic fuel produced, multiple tons of CO2 are released. Germany ignored those costs because short-term military needs dominated long-term environmental concerns. That calculation is no longer acceptable in an era of climate change.
Friedrich Bergius lived to see his invention power both world wars and win him a Nobel Prize, but his later life was troubled. Having worked with I.G. Farben during World War II, his citizenship came into question following the war. I.G. Farben was deeply complicit in Nazi atrocities, including production of Zyklon B used in concentration camp gas chambers and exploitation of forced labor. Bergius himself wasn't charged with war crimes. His involvement was technical rather than administrative, but his reputation was tainted. Bergius fled to Argentina in 1946, where he acted as advisor to the Ministry of Industry. He died in Buenos Aires on March 30, 1949, at age 64. His obituaries focused on his Nobel Prize and technical achievements, barely mentioning that his invention had helped sustain Nazi Germany through 6 years of war. That moral ambiguity is characteristic of the entire synthetic fuel story. The chemistry was brilliant. The engineering was impressive. The strategic application enabled evil. Technology is morally neutral. It's the uses to which it's put that carry moral weight. The inventor can't control how the invention is used, but the invention's existence enables uses, both beneficial and harmful, that wouldn't otherwise be possible.
From September 1, 1939 to May 8, 1945, Germany fought a mechanized world war without meaningful petroleum reserves. It conquered most of Europe. It launched massive armored campaigns across thousands of miles. It sustained a navy and air force for 6 years. It did this almost entirely on synthetic fuel produced from coal. 124,000 barrels per day at peak production. That's equivalent to a decent-sized oil field. Produced entirely through chemistry invented by Friedrich Bergius in 1913, and scaled to industrial production by German chemical companies through 2 decades of investment. The technology worked. It kept Germany's war machine running years longer than resource calculations suggested possible. It demonstrated that advanced chemistry and engineering can substitute for natural resources, at least temporarily, at great cost, and with enormous vulnerability to disruption. But synthetic fuel couldn't change the war's outcome. Germany lost because it was outnumbered, outproduced, and strategically overextended. Synthetic fuel delayed the inevitable. It didn't prevent it. The lesson isn't that synthetic fuel was unimportant. The lesson is that synthetic fuel was insufficient. Technology can extend capabilities and delay collapse, but technology alone can't overcome strategic disadvantages in industrial capacity, manpower, and, ultimately, the moral bankruptcy of fighting for conquest and genocide rather than survival and liberation. Germany fought 6 years without oil wells. It lost anyway. The chemistry was impressive. The strategy was doomed. And the human cost,
of the war synthetic fuel enabled was incalculable. Friedrich Bergius created the chemistry in 1913. Germany built the industry in the 1920s, 1930s. The Nazis weaponized it from 1939 to 1945. The Allies destroyed it in 1944. And the world learned that strategic independence through synthetic production is possible, but never without cost: economic, strategic, environmental, and moral.